At the outside, really thanks to Vishwa for giving us this opportunity to present some part of the work we have been doing. Without further ado, this is work we have been doing with youth at the risk of criminalization in the old city of Hyderabad. The story actually starts sometime in 2016, towards the end of 2016, when we filed a right to information to find out about the status of people who are on rowdy sheet or history sheeters, as the terminology used by the police goes. We are not really, confident that we'd receive any information, but to our utter surprise, we found that all the police zones of Hyderabad provided us with information. And when we looked at the information, we found that, about 2,000, more than 2,000 people in Hyderabad are on those rowdy sheets, and a further 2,000 odd people are on suspect, on what the police call suspect list. So altogether, close to 5,000 people are affected, were affected by this particular thing. And when we look closer at the data, what we found was predominantly the people on the rowdy sheet were really the distribution was really skewed, in the sense that the south zone of the city, which is largely the old city, the preponderance of these people were from there. And secondly, also the large number of Muslim youth who were put on these rowdy sheets. So because of our interest in working in the old city, our curiosity got piqued, and we went further into what really was going on. And when we started talking to some of these people, then we found that really these rowdy sheets which are there, which these people were mostly between the age of, say, 18 to 25, 26, the people we talked to, that being on the rowdy sheet really affected their lives very negatively. I mean, that was very clear, because, they can't get passports, because they can't get jobs which require police certification. They are in the neighborhood, their reputation takes a beating. And because avenues start closing down to them, then there's also the tendency that because they're already branded as kind of troublesome element, they tend to, go further down that path. And then we start talking to the police, like, what's the situation? How do you deal with these people? And what we found was really that the police had no structured way of dealing with the young people who are on these lists. What they had was, sporadic, what they call counseling sessions or something, where they'd all be called to some place. And then, some police officer harangues them with a lecture which goes on for 45 minutes or so. Otherwise, the only other thing which was there was that they were, every week they had to spend morning to evening in the police station on a given day. And then there's surveillance on them. So what we found was there's no structured pathway or no structured way of behavior they could get into, which will help them get out of the situation they are in. And the average number of years these people spend on a rowdy sheet is something like 10 to 12 years before the sheet is removed from them. So just imagine, if you're 20 or 21, by the time you get out of this situation, you're already into your 30s, and so many things are shut to you. And in the meantime, it's possible that you have gone further down that path and, get into some hardened criminalization. So we thought, this is something we really need to do something about and see what we can do about this thing. And, simultaneously, we're also talking with the police. And it was good in the sense that time the person who headed the South Zone Police, the Deputy Commissioner of Police, was one Mr. Amba Kishore Jha. And we got into some dialogue with him. And though he was very skeptical about what we were talking, he said, yeah, it's something, if it is done, it will be very nice. So we started kind of dialoguing with the police and also with these youth. And then what is to be done about this situation, right? You have to have some plan, some program to work on it. So we started scanning the literature related to juvenile delinquents and these kind of people across the world. And what we found was that in Chicago, there's been an initiative which seemed to, really give good results. So we went and we studied what they did in Chicago. And the crux of the matter is the reason why these young people, which is true in Hyderabad also, the reason why these young people get into these kind of situations is because of an automatic response. In a certain situation, they behave in a certain way. If you're together with a group and someone in the group says, "Chalo isko jaake marenge" or something like that, then people tend to go along with it, which is an automatic response. They don't stop. They don't stop and think, what am I getting into? Is this what really, what is the consequence of what I'm going to get into? So many of these young people, what happened is at some time in passion or just going along with other people, some 1 hour of their life or half an hour of their life, the consequence of that was, a decade long thing in which all their futures get blighted. So, Dr. Balaji, I'll request him to talk more about it. But essentially, what happened was we thought we should design a structured program where there'll be volunteering and they'll go through a certain process with us. At the end of which, they'll become more self-aware, and equally the police also, they'll have a way of assessing what this is. At present, the police, the system they have of removing people from the rowdy sheet is a combination of political influence, bribing. You have to pay your way out of it, and then maybe some politician is willing to, help you out or something. So it's that kind of way in which they come out of this, and that too after a long period of time. So if there's a structured thing that they can do, and which also the police is observing, then that could be given some weightage when the decision comes, because every 6 months they review these lists. So when they are reviewing the list, the track record of these people or how they have been behaving, and which could be observed by the police also, could be given some weightage in the decision to either continue them on the list or to remove them from the list. So in theory, it was good. The police said, okay, you want to do it, you can go ahead and do it. We won't give you any money. We don't give you any support. So you do it on your own. We are happy to support and cooperate with you. And so we got into this program, which we call Do Raste. Aaj ke something and kal ke anjam. That is today's, your decision today has consequences for tomorrow. And there are two paths which are open to you. That's the way we title the program. And and Dr. Balaji was so good, he's a very, very busy guy, but also he's very sensitive to Hyderabad and what goes on in Hyderabad. And so he thought we are going to doing a good thing. And he said, yeah, look, I'm willing to, get involved in this thing, and I'll put my effort into it. As a result of which, we ran a really very nice program where these people went through this kind of process along with volunteering, because volunteering is also, so they were doing community volunteering going through this program. And what resulted in, then I'll talk about that later, but this is the background. One further thing I'd like to say is the law governing these things is really a very old colonial law. And it is, there's a hangover of the colonial law into the present day, in the way the police behave, and it's part of the police manual and all. So even whole communities can be, branded as criminal. In the old city, there's a big area called Pardhiwada. The Pardhis are notified tribes, they're criminally notified tribes. So Pardhis, it is assumed that if you're a Pardhi, you have criminal tendencies, and at this thing, then the police action against you could be. So these kind of what you might call antediluvian acts and laws also contribute to the situation these people are in. So with that, I'd request Balaji to continue the story.
Thank you, Shashi, for inviting me into exciting journeys. And with Shashi and a few friends like that, never there is a lack of excitement. Like the Chinese say, may you live in interesting times. So whenever I live with Shashi, I think they're interesting times. I used to tell one of my bosses earlier, sir, every time you get a dream, I get a nightmare. So Shashi has dreams like that, which can create nightmares for anybody who's executing that stuff. But I think that's what change is all made up of, to be able to imagine some future beyond what is currently there, and then trying to change the status quo. I mean, that's what transformation is all about. So I was involved in many transformation journeys like that Satyam had, Shashi had. And this was no different. And actually, this was probably one of the most challenging tasks that was at hand. I was told some other person who ventured to work on this earlier, and that was did not get any very desirable outcomes. So we had started with kind of a balance sheet with some liabilities and certain anxieties. And I realized that this program can't be, it's not a typical run-of-the-mill program that you design for corporates or educated people who are wanting to change. You know, there is a certain amount of volition, they're willing to change. Here is a bunch of guys who are forced into a situation and probably we don't know where they're coming from. Probably they're resentful, probably they're upset, probably they're angry, probably they're sitting in victimhood. We are not too sure as to exactly what location they were, psychological location they were in, that's one. Two is that then we realized that the group, we tried, I asked Shashi to help to see the first group, because anytime that we do a proof of concept or venture something new, like a experiment, we say reduce the number of imponderables. So one of the key things we figured out was trying to keep the group as what do we call, homogeneous as possible. I mean, lack of a better word, I'm using that word, something as close as that, either in age group or something else of that kind. So we ended up with a fairly large cohort. Shashi will tell you the details. And then we had to work on this methodology that Shashi and his team identified, which was used in Chicago by the Juvenile Correction Board. And that was fairly successful. The random control trials conducted there showed that the recidivism reduced by anywhere between 30% to 45%. That means 30 to 45% of the people were unlikely to get into trouble again. And that was a fairly significant kind of a transformation. I think 30% to 40% people not getting back to their old lifestyle is a fantastic thing. So I was very excited. But the challenges were a few. So I'll just talk a little bit about the design of the course and how did we execute it. Can't be called a course. I should call it a process. Probably is a much better word. I'll just share with you some of the design elements that we took into consideration, certain activities that were taken up, and certain lessons that we got from that. And because we also have to manage time, I will try to keep it as short as possible. So first thing was to think of a methodology, and then we had this methodology based on CBT, cognitive-based therapy, which I'll talk a little bit about that. And then we had to construct a team which can execute it. Third thing was figure out a way of delivering this to these people. End of the day, it's a communication exercise, and no so-called learning interventions, etc., can be without communication. So what will be the mode of communication? What is the method, language, etc., etc. So there are 2-3 considerations that we had. As we assembled a team, and many of them, I should thank them, because they were as daring and as entrepreneurial and as experimental as Thomas, who were that cook guy who went to the North Pole kind of a thing. They're willing to tie themselves with us in this journey. I should thank Vandana, I should thank Javed Jamal, I should thank Ravi and Jaya and many people from the Yuganthar team, like Tej and Deepika and all, Akram and Karim, quite a few people. The question was, how do we put this team together and with disparate capabilities? So what we looked for, a common thing in all of the co-facilitators that I chose, was primarily they should have worked a little bit on process work, or what we call human process work, or what they are called labs, T labs or I labs, or various kind of types of methodology, anything where people have worked on certain amount of processing that happens with human minds and some level of sensitivity. So that cannot be trained in a very short time. So, and we were fortunate. So I had a dictum earlier, trespassers will be recruited. So whoever was talking to me, I would say, okay, would you be interested in working with me as a co-faculty on this? So I'm lucky enough to get these very bright people to work with me. And the other challenge was what language do we speak with them, because much of the the whole Chicago manual was in English, and many of these people were semi-literate. Some of them were fifth pass or sixth pass or 10th pass. Many of them probably had dropped out of school. So the language has to be a language that is Hyderabadi, what we call Dakhni, a little bit of Hindi and Urdu and a little bit of Telugu. And there were some people whose mother tongues were Telugu. So we also had to do it. And so it was a multilingual program. So one of the key things was to choose that, because CBT, the content that we based our program was from the Chicago team. So there had a lot of technical words and very specific words that were there. So we had to find equivalent of that in Urdu and something that made sense and people could relate to with examples and all that. So it was a continuous learning journey. So that was another part. And the other thing that we took a call was since some of the co-facilitators had never attended a lab or never conducted a lab, we had to expose them to a little bit of what we call, I won't call it sensitivity training, sensing training, getting us being in touch with one's emotions and then sense a situation and what's happened and react to that with some level of compassion and certain level of kindness, while not losing your cognitive abilities or cognition. So what we did was we kind of ran the whole program weeks ahead on ourselves. The whole thing, the whole team went through. It wasn't very, what do you say, without its own challenges. You know, it's not easy to be a part of a semi-processing lab. So it wasn't a very unstructured lab like a Tavistock kind of a thing, or like a, the T groups in the US kind of stuff. We didn't. It was a slightly diluted version of that, but it did work because we could test the material on ourselves to see what works, what doesn't work. And of course, we did have Karim and Akram as a part of the team. So they were my instant dictionaries to help me find the right Urdu words to be able to talk to these people. That was interesting. And we put this thing together. And then the challenge was we had to do it only during the weekends. And theoretically, we got a 2.5 hour or 3 hour kind of a slot. Invariably, this 3 hour slot used to get shortened to about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. So whatever you wanted to achieve in a session, you had to be very creative to be able to build that. So what were some of the principles that we deployed in terms of executing this? As you know, CBT typically talks about a few things. First thing is that it is a cognitive behavioral therapy based principles. So behavior is seen and anchored in the way we cognize or our cognition of the world or how we perceive the world. So these perceptions somehow lead us to act in a way. And oftentimes there are quite a few things that we act in a very, like Shashi mentioned earlier, in a very automatic sense. And Shashi had this important thesis that, that of course is a great fan, and I'm also a great fan of Daniel Kahneman and Tversky's work on thinking fast and thinking slow. What we call the automatic part of the brain, which grew over millennia as human beings or Homo sapiens that we grew, and some part of it, the neocortex, which developed much later. So where we need to reflect and then think and then process it and then act on it. The two parts of a thinking system. One is thinks very fast, that is the automatic system. The other one thinks very slow, that we reflect, we react, and then come to a conclusion as to how we want to react or respond to that. So oftentimes, many behaviors become like muscle memory. Many of you know when we drive a car, initially everything looks too complex. After some time, without our knowledge, we keep shifting gears, shifting down, using the clutch, accelerator, and all kinds of things we keep doing. You know, we know steering. Otherwise, ABC plus steering isn't an easy thing when we start driving. It looks too complicated and too complex. Either the car goes patak or it goes wine kind of thing, doesn't move at all. So we know that. But after some time, it all becomes automatic for us. So we know how to convert many situations, many experiences of engaging, adapting to the world. We make things automatic. So these automatic behaviors drive us without our being conscious. So that's what Shashi's thesis was. So if you were to speak in simple English, what we say, a momentary lapse of reason, where we have an automatic behavior, leads to consequences that you have to live with for a long time. And many of the consequences need not be very pleasant, as Shashi already mentioned. So the question, therefore, was how do we design it? How do we deliver it? And one or two decisions we took very clearly. We said this is not going to be in a pedantic or a lecture mode. It has to be experiential. So how do you devise experiential exercises where people cannot write and people cannot read? How do you build that was one question. Two, the group was about, originally it was about 40, 50 people. It ended up being around 30 people or so. For 50 people, how do you give an experience for them as if they are learning in a small group? So we wanted to replicate or offer the intensity and the privacy and the coziness of a small group at the same time in a larger setting. So we kind of numb down the large-scale interactive processes that are used by corporates and rest of the world, where people are trained, 1,000 people are trained at the same time together. The core thing there is, at any table, you don't have more than 7 to 10 people. So that's like a small group. You have a private group there. And we were also concerned saying that since these people have a tendency to work in gangs, and the gangster mind comes in and that they might collude and then start disrupting other parts of the groups is a possibility. So we ensure that groups are always formed randomly. That was both pluses to it and minus to it, because this was we had to deal with the anxiety of some of the facilitators who were first time ever meeting people which society would have termed them as criminals or murderers. Actually, they had cases against them in terms of murders and other kinds of stuff. So people are also concerned and worried, saying that, look here, we're going to work with these people. We don't know what flips them, and what if they flip, if I confront them, if I ask them a question. So this was a true anxiety. So to de-risk that, we had devised it in such a way that the groups were constantly mingled and mixed so that people have different experience. And that also was so that they sense everybody else and there's a different learning experience for them. And then we had the facilitators at each of the tables to work with. And wherever there was written exercises to be done, the facilitators were helping them in terms of making sense of that and documenting it, which would process that. And the other thing CBT talks about is about from cognitions and helping you understand what kind of automatic behaviors you tend to get caught into. And once we know what the automatic behavior that we get into, how do we overcome that? So that needed practice. We say that's a skill. Like Buddha says, it's a prajna or panna. So skill needs drill. So we had to create enough experimental spaces for them, micro spaces for them to try that many times so that they become familiar with it. So many times change happens in the mind, then that has to get into muscle memory. For that, you have to practice a little. So we created spaces for practice. So these micro experiments, or what we call micro practices, and those spaces were created. Then finally, the other thing that we kept in mind was, since this group is, this is a proof of concept or an experiment in our Indian context, and especially in the old city context, we thought we will keep the design not rigid, but keep it open enough for us to be able to make changes in an emergent way. In the sense that we send something that we could react to it and then slightly modify the design or modify the exercises, modify whatever. And since the group also had both Hindus and Muslims as a religious group that it came from, we had to create that kind of a balance in the whole facilitator group and everything else. That we were fortunate enough to get very high quality people and very committed and competent people to work with us. And finally, in the process of the execution, I'll talk of a couple of challenges that were there. One of the things is that we never had the opportunity of getting a air-conditioned, soundproof kind of a room. We had to find something that was closer and comfortable for them. So in their milieu, they feel more comfortable. So we picked up something in the old city itself. The challenge was since the room was not soundproof, and when we run the program, suddenly we would get azan, the muezzin's call for prayer at different points of time. And it was not one. There were 4 or 5 masjids around, and every 2-3 minutes, one more thing would start. So being culturally sensitive is something that also helped us. And we would shut the program when that would come. So initially we didn't know what was hitting us. So suddenly there's a theme and a continuity and some kind of a momentum built, and in between you have to take a break and rebuild that momentum was tough. So we had to adapt ourselves to anticipate when this azan would come. So either end it before or start something after. Because if some we are building some kind of a climax kind of a thing in an exercise of creating and building the emotions or thought process, there is a logical end that is coming. So we can't get something cut. It's like you're watching a good detective film and suddenly before the end something is cut off and you lose the momentum and the whole that thing is lost. So some of these were real challenges and our team adapted fairly well to that. And lastly, I think we're coming to the close of our time that is there. I'll just try to quickly close. One of the things that we tried to do was keep sensing. And in the process of sensing, we found when I was talking in the first session about an interesting thing that I was recounting. One of the things in CBT it says is, as facilitators and faculty, you have to build rapport. Any program, you have to build rapport. But in certain programs, the facilitators don't care. They don't need to do that probably. But it was very critical that we build that trust in us, because some of them were forced by the police to join. Some of them came voluntarily, all kinds of things. So our thought was like this: however they came here, we have to hold them in such a way. The program by itself must be the star attraction, and they should continue forward. And that's the proof of the pudding where the program is concerned. So when I talked about one of the key things is to build trust. In building trust, you share a little. You have to build something. So I was sharing something about my father telling me that no job is dirty. He said, it's okay, you become a toilet cleaner, doesn't really matter. But can you be the best toilet cleaner in the world or in the area that you are in? Can you do a good job? Was this question. So I said, there's nothing in the world is more or less in terms of work. And suddenly they started clapping. Then I realized, then in the evening when we were clinicking, we figured out that probably they were sensitive to their significance in the society. So significance and dignity become very important. So we ensured that we held that dignity through and through. We were very cautious saying that we will never indignify, we will never look anybody down, and we treat them with tremendous amount of respect as if we would do any other colleague that we were training or managing in a corporate or in a real world, in our own universes. So that was one thing that happened. As to give an example of an emergent, very quickly understanding and sensing what is needed, and then we devise things around it. So I could go on, but interesting thing is that we built a lot of things to do with their hands, and that allowed them to be very exciting and fun. And we also made it a little bit of fun because learning happens, or your judgments come down when you smile or laugh. So how do you make them laugh and other kinds of things? Fortunately, I grew up in some part of Hyderabad, so some advantage of Hyderabadi sayings, etc., could help me get a connect, and then they would smile and laugh. Once people smile and laugh, and they feel valued in a group. So we had these small wins that we created every day, and would immediately give them. It's a silly thing like a small chocolate we would throw, and there'll be fun, and there'll be laughter around, and then. And that also makes them a little bit of childlike. So all your so-called adult guards and all the things, the macho kind of a stunt that we want, keep it aside. And at a human level, can we open up and connect? And that's how communication happens. Once people are open to engage with you, then it is possible to create some amount of exchange of ideas, and then people can engage with you. So that's something that we did together, and my team was fantastic in terms of some of the games that they came up with and suggestions that they came up with. So it was a very collaborative, fun, challenging and exciting kind of a 3 months kind of a program. And then the duration of the course also was of sessions. If we felt that it had to be expanded a little, we expanded. We went a little beyond the brief of the Chicago group as well, because we had to, for example, the emotional literacy of the people was important for us. For us, many of us know it's not just anger. In the universe of anger, we have multiple shades of that. We get annoyed, we get irked, we get irritated, we get angry, and we get outraged, and we get enraged. So I'm just giving you a half a dozen of them in one emotion called anger, or being uncomfortable, or you can be utterly, I'm a little uncomfortable, you might say. So it's a very polite way of saying that we're discomfort. So all of them are in the same universe, same spectrum. So we help them say that emotions are not single, and there are multiple hues are there, and a different hue, because any response that you are making, the emotional response can be graduated, can be calibrated. Need not be, everything need not be a violent explosion. Everything need not be anything, whether positive or negative. That there are shades, and you have a choice of picking up. So these are a few things that we try together. I think I can go on forever. I think we need to manage time. Shashi, I'll stop at this point of time, and probably we could take up questions. And
No, I think I'd also kind of take 5 minutes, if possible, take 5 minutes to wind the thing down. Is that okay?
Sure, sir. Yes, sir. Please.
Yeah. So, I mean, the flavor and the theory behind what we did, Balaji has explained it very nicely. There was one more element to this whole thing also, which I think is worth mentioning, is that this group really did community service for 2 hours on every weekend. So that volunteering also was, I think, an important part of this thing. And the major part of their volunteering they did in a community kitchen. So on weekends they'd help to cook and help to serve under the Davirpura flyover. Well, there's a person called Maksusi who does this, and so they became volunteers with the work he's doing. So I think that also contributed to their sense of, that there are other angles and other things which need to be done in society, and it's not always about yourself. So that was also, I think, a very good thing. But the outcome of what we have done is really, the first meeting we had, there were about 90 people who had turned up for that. And once we started the course, like Balaji said, we started off with about 50 people. And since it went on over 3 months or 3.5 months, about 30 people really completed the course properly, in the sense, they had about 70 to 80% attendance in all the sessions. So, which I think was a very good number, the 30 people. And because it was really voluntary also, in the sense it was not, initially though we took the help of the police to mobilize them, later people who continued with the process continued on their own volition. So it was largely voluntary, their participation and their interest, which developed in what was going on. So that was a very good thing. And in the end of it, actually, what happened was in the subsequent reviews of these rowdy sheets, out of the 30 people who went through this thing sometime last year, I think last year, June or sometime, about 10 of them had their rowdy sheets removed. I don't know what the latest situation is, but I can also tell you one very nice thing, that Yugantar as an organization, we do a lot, like I said, we work in the old city. So during the pandemic, so we are working with 6 PHCs in the old city. And we have about 30 volunteers working every day in these PHCs to help in the testing and the vaccination, community outreach, all kinds of activities we are doing. And I'm very happy to say a good number of people who are volunteering in the work we are doing, pandemic related work, are people who participated in this journey with us. That is, the rowdy sheeters are the people who are now doing this volunteering work, which I think is really something quite extraordinary. And and we wanted to continue with this process, but of course, this whole pandemic related thing, whatever has happened, that has put a kind of a spanner in the works for the moment. And as and when things open up, then we plan to go on with it. And we actually, at that time, when the police said we don't, we can't give any resources, but you could go and do whatever you please. Then we are very fortunate that we had applied for and we got a research grant from something called IDRC, International Development Research Center. So they provided a grant to us, a small grant, and it was with the that grant also helped in making this whole journey possible. And also very it's not strange, but very nicely, The person who was the head of the police at that place, Mr. Amba Kishore Jha, who observed some of this stuff, he also was really positively impacted, and hopefully, some other way of addressing this issue will develop over a period of time and get mainstreamed as and when the police decide to absorb it and try it themselves with their own ownership. Yeah. So with those, I think, are we out of time, Mani? You are muted. You are muted. Yeah.
Would you like the video to be played now?
No, are we out of time? Then
we are. We need to take some questions.
Yeah.
After the video, if that's all right.
Yeah. Surely. So there's a testimonial we have from Mr. Jha, which will play out now.
It was really a new thing for me because we have never come across any such experience. My almost 8 years of experience, we had tried from our side, from police side, to convince the people to change their course of life. Sasi Garu and his team, they all took time, spent time not only with me, but with my whole team, to the down level of the constable and the police station head, who has the actual responsibility of running the police administration. So after this conversation at multiple level, gold which comes out is very limited, but still it is gold. And you people were able to filter out that gold. 25% success is still a great success from my point of view. 1/3 converting 1/3 people into a decent civilian who were able to get themselves out from this the bad persons list. I think it is really commendable in the first attempt. We must look for improving it in future. But what I appreciate even more than that number is the dedication of your team. I was really surprised to see experts coming from Bangalore, coming from Delhi to talk these people.
I would like to kickstart the Q&A session, sir, if you don't mind, and either of you can answer this. Essentially, it's in the best interest of society that these elements or this sort of behavior is identified early on, because I think individuals do not get criminalized or caught the first, second, or the third time. I think it's over a period of time of repeated behavior that they actually end up paying the penalty for it. So as a society, or as parents, teachers, or well-wishers, how may we identify behavior such as this and save our children, save our youth, and so nip it in the bud, so to speak, before it actually gets to a point wherein charge sheets are filed and rowdy sheets are filed? Either of you says.
Yeah, it's a very pertinent thing you're asking. Do we wait for people to get on the rowdy sheets before we do anything? Yeah, and you're right. Children, when you're growing up, say late teens into the early 20s, when people are growing up, it's a time of really very great change in them as personalities. They haven't yet become what they are going to be. And also there's a lot of hormonal thing which is going on in people, all of which have impacts on behavior. So since we are talking about a particular segment of population and not generalizing, but one thing which is there, though what we have done is we have worked with people on the rowdy sheets itself. The police also have surveillance on what they term as suspects, which are equal number. That is, they are people who have come to their attention who are not yet charged with this or that, but who they are keeping an eye on. They may not be having cases, or they may just have some petty thing on them, but they are on a suspect list. So from our point of view and within the framework of this program, actually that would be the target population, that before something happens which is irrevocable, how do you identify the people, because those people are already identified, and that is the segment, or those are the people you need to work with. In general terms, of course, this thing of self-awareness, which is what cognitive behavioral training or therapy does. How do you become aware of yourself and your automatic responses? It's a process, I think, which is useful for everybody. You don't have to be a criminal to really find value in it. I mean, it's valuable to everybody. So I think in general terms, if in syllabuses or in anything, something like this is built in education curricula or whatever, it will be very valuable. But in terms of what we are trying to do, I think people on the suspect list would be really the targets or really the people we'd be looking for.
There's one question, sir, from Balaji C. What results did your initiative, generate? Were you happy with it? I think you've already touched on this in your main talk. And I understand that because of the COVID situation, there's been a temporary halt on this. But are there any anecdotes that you can give us that,
I could, good morning, Dr. Balaji C. Dr. C. Balaji, yeah. No, in terms of collateral, what we have got out of this is we got a manual that we have made of what we have used and how it has worked. Based on that, we have reviewed, and there's a training manual that we have developed with kind of notes to facilitators how they should be using it. So that's one kind of outcome of one kind. In the other sense, out of the 30 people who actually went through this, 10 people really have got their rowdy sheets lifted. Many of them now are participating, like I said, in these kind of work which are doing volunteering in, in community causes. The third thing which has happened really is Mr. Amba Kishore Jha, who was the DCP, has moved on, and he's the director of a training institute in Delhi. And he thinks, so he deals with Naxalites and Kashmiris, and because he's in a national situation. So he's actually invited us to Delhi. It hasn't yet happened to share and talk about the validity of what we are doing, because there are youth in other places and may not be the kind of youth that we were working with, but these are people who are either getting into these into these kind of movements. I should say one thing though, which is very important, which we didn't mention, that our program was really ideology free. What we are just telling people is, you think about what you're going to do and what consequences it's going to have. Be aware of it. And if you still want to go and do it, you're free to go and do it. We are not saying this is bad, that is good, we are not making value judgments. We are just saying, think, be aware of what you're doing and what the consequences of that might be. So he's interested in us coming and telling, maybe a TOT kind of training of trainers kind of program might be in the offing, which as an outcome of whatever work we have done. Balaji, if you'd like to add anything.
No, I think you rightly said. One is the proof of pudding is in the terms of numbers and outcomes that have come, what we call ROTI, return on training investment. But the point is that apart from all of that, some anecdotal evidence also, probably Shashi can join in, is that there was this mother who used to work in the auditorium where we were conducting this program. Her child also was in this. He was known as having very mercurial temper. And as a part of our CBT, we also helped them teach mindful meditation. How to calm yourself down when you are overcome by emotion, you're angry or whether you're getting very tense or whatever. How do you calm yourself down? So the mother later shared with our colleagues who work in the community there that he has become much calmer. He is a painter by profession, so he is focusing on that. And interestingly, CB, we had given one exercise of giving something to people. And we were amazed at the amount of giving that these fellows have done. One weekend, we gave them exercises, like every week we give them something to work on as a part of the CBT. And I said, do something good for a few people and come back and tell us. And you won't believe, some guy who was an electrician went and did for free a poor woman who was getting a daughter married, the whole lighting he has done for them. Another person has donated some 5,000 to somebody. another person has given food to one very poor family, etc. So like that, not that these people are very rich or super rich or anything, from their resources. So therefore, that one of the key things in CBT in this particular program we had, me and my community, that you are posited in a community, you cannot keep yourself out of that. And as long as you're connected there, somebody also was asking some of the questions. Your social anchors will give you the necessary balance that you need to be able to deal with something. Before you react, it's like you're married and you have children. Some thought might come, what will happen to my children? What will happen to my family? So some of those also. So once you're anchored there, so that also transformation. So these are non-quantified or quantitative kind of measures, so to speak. There are a lot of soft outcomes that have happened. I think our time is short, but we can recount the number of anecdotal transformations that we have seen people do that. Some of them self-admittedly said, nowadays I don't get easily angry, so I calm myself down. And every time that you said this breathing exercise I do, every time I feel angry, etc. So these were all small things that also might be worth looking at.
Thank you, sir. I think we have some attendees that are raising their hands. If we can start with Neerja Singh. Can my team please allow? Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Hello.
please. Thank you very much. I just have two questions. One, I was curious whether your work in Chicago involved the Safer Foundation. Did you, because they're also very deeply into recidivism. That was because I have an association with Safer Foundation. And second was that in India, are there no urban educated cases where urban educated youth become part of this component, and then there's this thing of sensitizing the employers also, society also, because there's so much of judgment and a stigma there that if a young person is a history sheeter or if there's a rowdy sheeter, then they are not viewed favorably. So that is also a huge task to sensitize the society and accept them, despite their being history sheeters or rowdy sheeters, what you would call. So how are you approaching that? Is that a challenge that you're working on also? Thank you.
But Balaji, would you like to say something, respond? Or?
I think we haven't had a formal engagement with the Safer Foundation, so to speak. However, I 100% agree with you that that it is necessary that some of these things are, like Shashi earlier also mentioned, the CBT components are necessary for all of us. And these people are on history sheets, and unfortunately, they're visible to us. There's a lot of invisible crime or invisible behavior that happens, like, for example, violence at home. And, I've seen educated people. I worked in an IT company. We do hear domestic violence and abuse of women or children, other kinds of stuff. So this is useful and valuable. How do we build that and then take it to the larger question? I think the brief that we had was to explore and experiment and see whether there can be an intervention that can make a difference beyond the vagaries of somebody's mind or something of that kind. So a structured program to bring into the whole process. I think that was the limited brief that we had. But again, any expansion of these things depends on resources and larger things. And given the resources that we got from the donor, that we built this one. But one good thing is that both Shashi and I believe in copyleft, and I think Shashi conducted a workshop and documented all of this into a manual, like you said. And I think there's a possibility of doing TOT or train the trainer, whoever is interested, that would have some value. Shashi, you want to add?
Yeah, I think your point about, the larger society being sensitized to what is a very well taken point, and that's really not been in our radar screen because it has not been.
Hello.
Extend that little bit, we have engaged with the communities from which these people come at a local level, and try to see that because even very locally, there are things like, their sisters find difficulty in getting married, and stuff like that also happens. And so to kind of improve their standing in the community, and that's one of the reasons why we also got into this volunteering program. So that if they are seen to be doing these various things which is for the community, the perceptions about these people might change in the larger community. So that was a kind of a deliberate thing that we did, saying that how they are perceived should also be changed. And the thing about educated, say, middle class or upper middle class kids in rowdy sheets is actually very strange. You know, if you see the whole thing, there's, I mean, not just economically upper, if you were to break it down by caste, you'd see that, you know, there's no one from limited people from what you might call the upper caste who are in this rowdy sheets. So it's these Muslims who are there, the Pardis are there, Dalits are there, Yadavs, and you know, all the guys who are in that,
OBC category. That is.
some of them are there. So it's largely BCs, SCs, and Muslims who are on this, and educated upper class, upper caste people. I mean, and men. There's only one woman, the whole one or two women who are there, and they're there. I mean, I think she was a madam, or she was running a brothel or something, and for some reason like that, she's there. But other than that, the presence of other people is not there really.
And in any case,
Hello.
the caste and class are coterminous in India in some way. That also shows something. Yeah, please go ahead. I think somebody is asking a question.
I think we have a raised hand from Mr. Sahadev Komargiri. Sir, if you can unmute. Thank you.
Good morning, Balaji sir and Shashi Garu. Very happy to hear all the wonderful work that you're doing. I wanted to ask you if girls also get into trouble. We started an NGO and we work with a number of teenagers in multiple areas, and we work with both boys and girls. And I wanted to know if girls also get into trouble like this. That's question number one. I have a lot of questions, but I will limit myself to this. One of our boys got into a trouble because he has a bike. We usually tell our parents not to give bikes to kids unless it is absolutely necessary. But this kid, along with his bike, went on a trip with a couple of friends to very badly injure a woman. And this boy was not involved in that activity, that violent activity directly himself, but he was responsible for taking the other kids on his bike. That was the only trouble. And he's on the rowdy sheeter list right now. He's struggling quite a bit to get out of that situation. He was in jail for some time, then he came out, but he's on the rowdy sheeter list. If I come across anyone like that, where do we start, and how long does this process take, sir?
The average time people spend on these lists is 10 years. You know, so it's actually really very. I mean, that boy is in really trouble. He can't get a passport. He can't get a police clearance certificate if he wants to do anything. So he's really in trouble. And how does that? I mean, how does that 10 years become 5 years or 6 years? Or at present, really the only ways to do it is, you know, see whether you have some influence or you can catch hold of some leader, or you know some bureaucrat or some other senior police officer and try to work your way like that, because the police really don't have a structured way to deal with this kind of issue. I mean, it's sad, but there's really, you know, once you're in that situation, I mean, you're really very badly stuck.
Sir, I think there was also a gender element to
women getting in trouble with the police doesn't exist. Like I said, you know, out of these 5,000 people on the police list, I think only one of them was a woman, one or maybe two. So women in this context don't appear at all.
Okay. So sorry, I have a number of questions, but I'll limit to one more, maybe two. I wanted to know, what if, see, when there is some trouble, when someone gets into trouble, like a driving license violation or a road violation, traffic violation, they are expected to take a course, maybe in the US again, or maybe even in India in some cases. They are expected to take a course. Once they complete that course, and after a period of time, they get out of it. right? Is there a similar approach sometime, at least in the far future or even in the near future, that something like that can be applied to these situations, especially when there is no previous case on this boy or previous case on these case? In the case of boys like this, they have no previous history, they have a fantastic academic record. My boy is really good at yoga, good at karate, and many things. It was like you mentioned earlier, there is that a moment of lapse in judgment that he was dragged into this situation. But again, my question is there a process, a legal process, or some kind of a remedial process? They attend a course, they do certain things, and then they come out of it. That's question number one. Question number two is, what can NGOs like me, like mine, can do to prevent kids from getting into this? We counsel them, we tell them number of things, how not to get into trouble, but again, they still get into trouble. Is there a structured program that NGOs like ours, which deal with teenagers, can implement at our places?
Balaji, I seem to be hogging the answers, so why don't you?
No, I think you're I think I'm smart enough. All tough questions, I should leave it to you and let go. But in any case, I think it may not be a bad idea to have a separate discussion with Shashi.
Yeah.
The organizers can share it with you, Komargiri Garu, Sadev Garu. I understand the trouble and the pain that you are going through. One of the things that we had in mind was to use these the people who are products of the first training to be as a model to other people. And it did happen. Some of them went around and told their friends and younger people, saying that, boss, I got into trouble and don't do that and have to go through all of this kind of stuff. So you could think of inviting some of these products from this training program to come and then be resource persons for your youngsters, where they can talk about what they had to go through, what life is like. I think otherwise you tell somebody, they won't believe it. It has to be some cohort or some age group at the same level. Probably that peer learning is much more powerful, as much as other kinds of learnings are. So at this point of time, I'll stop.
Which is yours. And the requirement for such a program to be institutionalized in order for it to, reach a wider impact zone, and how institutionalization of such interventions lose the initial gusto or the initial, as the speaker had put it, they lose the spirit of the original intervention, and how we can sort of preserve it and scale at the same time.
Balaji, the study, of what they did in Chicago. There's a study. It was studied by academics and everything, and actually they worked out the cost-benefit analysis. How much does it cost per person to go through this as compared to the other kind of things. The thing is, the police is already spending money on this thing, on the surveillance and on the informers, and they have a whole system by which they keep track of these people, which is quite resource intensive. So as costs go, what we are doing, how does it compare with that? And what is the thing? It is something which can be worked out. And my own feeling is that what we did is in the longer run, it's probably going to be cheaper than what the police are doing right now. It's both going to be cheaper and it's going to be more effective, I think. So that's the first point, about how the sustainability of it is going to be. And the second point is that there needs to be an advocacy with the police because unless it gets owned by the police, this thing it's not going to go forward very much. Maybe if it's going to be dependent on NGOs or something like that. So the police has to have an ownership of this. And I think the delivery of the content itself, it doesn't need any heroic effort. Maybe the first time people get into it, because they are the design issues, they are this issues, and it's a new field. So maybe you are more resource heavy, or maybe you need a greater intellectual input in the first time you do, when you do the proof of concept or the initial pilots. But once that is done, then it's a question of delivering this thing. And there are enough people now in the country who are trained to be CBT facilitators and so on, who know about all of this thing and how it can be done. So it's saying that CBT material tailored to a cohort like this to be delivered by a CBT trained facilitator, and the police accepting it as a worthwhile way to do this thing and monitoring it. I think it's a wonderful thing, and actually that's the direction we want to work at. And if we manage to get enough advocacy and support and everything going, that's the direction it needs to go. So I think it's very doable, and it won't really lose its effectiveness because it's a methodology and everything. No, it doesn't depend on, it's not dependent on individual excellence or individual heroic effort or stuff like that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. We have a couple of raised hands. I had Usha Raman raise her hand. Arka Samantha will take your question after Usha ma'am asks hers. Ma'am, do we have you with us?
Yeah, so thanks Balaji and Shashi for that, really inspiring presentation. In some ways, my question has been answered. The sustainability question also was mine. But I would, Balaji kind of mentioned in passing this whole idea of macho, right, and machismo, which drives a lot of the, the activity of these young men. And I'm wondering to what extent in your training you addressed issues of gender and, peer influences, particularly around this notion of masculinity and maleness.
Yeah, I think, Shashi, why don't you answer that? I think
no, I'll answer half of it. Funnily enough, no, now that you mentioned it, one of the kind of things we are getting out of this is a study on the construction of masculinity amongst these young people. So we are doing a gender study, which is looking, framing the issues of masculinity and really what you're talking about, this machoism or machismo, and how much of it is cultural, how much of it is really, stuff which is innate in to do with, let's say, the primitive part of the brain, as they put it, how much of it is nurture and how much of it is nature, and what
the lizard brain.
So, I mean, those kind of issues are there, and that's the study, I mean, the report we are writing, and actually some more field work we had to do for it, which didn't happen. So that we'll be writing that report. So, yeah, of course, and really this whole thing of automatic response and to be aware of, we had a very elaborate thing of, what are the danger signals, khatre ki ghanti. So we got these people to, identify situations, which are situations which can spark something like this. So, and we named it Khatre Ki Ghanti, the bell of danger, when they should become really cognitive or become self-aware, slow down their thinking, count backward from 10 to 1 or whatever else you need to do at that time. So certainly what you're saying is very true. Young people, especially in groups, the behavior young males can get up to when they are in groups together is certainly a thing. And the point is really to build this awareness amongst them, and also to see how much of it is culturally derived and how much of it is really part of growing up as a man.
And one more thing is that providing alternative role models, that what they have seen in their life was salient in their minds in terms of successful male role models or authority figures. So by exposure and meeting other people and seeing and creating spaces of that kind, that also gets reconstructed. And I think we've done a lot of role plays inside the group. And interestingly, I insisted that some of our female co-facilitators handle some of the sessions so that the whole question of authority and relating to authority, feminine and masculine, get some sense of it. They have to experience. So we did that, and I think it was fairly fine in the way they started engaging with. So I think the key issue is providing it. See, one thing about nature, if you say there's nothing much we can do about it, you and I can't do anything about my genetics. I don't think I can become as tall as Amitabh Bachchan or like Shashi, you know, my height is done. But my behavior is something that I can play with. So that sense, once people get it, and that it's possible to transform those in those small ways, is a way to go. And your institutional kind of a question, Nusha, I think broadly, in my experience, when we did 108 and 104, it's very important first to break the path or path breaking solutions that we see. Many times we wonder, God, I never thought about this, it can be done so easily. So once people see that it can be done, it will get scaled. So we say there's something called a proof of concept, and then you do something at a pilot level, and then you do scale, full replicate and scale it, what we call. However, I understand what you're trying to say in terms of the intensity with which you have held it and managed it, and like Shashi said, resource intensive and too many brains. It's a too high-powered team that we kind of put together. But do you need an axe where a small nail can be used to chop off something? You can dumb it down. But whichever way, even if it gets diluted, the question is this: it's better to have a diluted version of something available to a large number of people rather than have a very high quality, small kind of a thing. This was done primarily to demonstrate because there are too many imponderables. We didn't want anything to go wrong. As we go down, like Shashi said, it's all manuals and workshops and train the trainer. And level of effectiveness will be different for different people. Their ability or professionalism with which they deal with, that's fine. But that doesn't hurt. You know, it's better to have at least a khichdi rather than no meal at all. You know, that's the view. So institutionalization does bring some level of intensity down, but that's fine. Nothing to worry about is my sense. Thanks.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Usha ma'am, for your question. We have one more question from Arka Samantha. If you can please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Actually, we need to be aware. I think this is my absolute opinion. We need to be aware about our psychological aspect of our child by being aware of their mindset, mood, and the structure of their mind. And also, we need to teach them about how to behave with our other and should be observing about their behavioral pattern and all activities they are doing in a day. We have to keep monitoring all the actions and all the activities they are doing or they are taking in a day, because and their friend circle what kind of friend circles they are having, because these kind of factors, actually I think these kind of factors are the main important or root cause of how will they grow in their future in every aspect of their life. And also taking consideration as the parenting as the part of this whole process, we need to be aware about that what kind of parenting operations we are taking or we are portraying to our child. Is it kind of authority parenting? Is it kind of any kind of other parentings? Because the authority parenting is the most important, fruitful, and beneficial parenting, because this kind of parenting includes the responsive power to the with expectation. This kind of parenting sets some kind of standards and the rules in the family and in the society, and also this kind of parenting is the structure type and is the kind of rules and the power over the child, and also give the punishment to our child to make their future more fruitful. So my question, there are two actually questions I can have from this whole thing. What kind of my first question is that, okay, 1 minute. My first question is that, is there any extracurriculum activity that can affect our child's psychology or the mindset? Is there one aspect? And second aspect is that that's the most important, very much important aspect. Our society is very much negative, and actually our child is always dealing with some kind of negative emotions always. So how can our child, how can we teach our child to learn about the emotional management so that they can deal with the all kind of negative emotions like the depression, anxiety, angerness, sadness, all kind of negative emotions by preventing their criminal mind actually. That's the second question. And final question is that what kind of parenting should we take, or should we take as an initiative so that this can be more fruitful for the future of our child? That's it.
I agree with what you're saying, the importance of the family.
Yes.
The growth of during the growing stages of children or adolescents or so on. You are very right in saying that. And actually, we also find that in many instances, some of these things happen because of a lack of, let us say, parental supervision or parental awareness. And these young men are left to their own devices, and it is the company which they get into and so on, along with their own whatever it is. So what you're pointing out is very true, that the family is a very important thing, and within the family, whoever the parents are, that they should be aware of what their children are doing and so on, all the rest of what you have said. I think it is very true. But unfortunately, there are so many people in society who are growing up without that kind of concern and care, which you are talking about. And more or less, the people we are dealing with or we are talking belong to that part of society. So really, I don't know what I could comment on what you have said, except to agree with you.
Thank you,
Okay,
sir.
thank you.
Balaji, sir, anything for you would like to add?
No, I think Shashi has succinctly shared that, and I think agreeing that the only thing that we have is that some of us are fortunate to have our families. In India, we say it's the lottery of the womb, in which womb we were born and which kind of family that you were born. And family is the primary socializing system. So obviously, a lot of our lack of perspective or perspectives we gather from the family. So that a lot of work that needs to be done. It's a larger social issue. But I think our limited focus has been here to work with people who don't have that kind of a fortunate situation and they get into trouble. So how do we take them forward was the broad question. I agree with Shashi and I agree with Mr. Arka Samantha as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We have a very interesting question. And it's from Vijay Raghavan. And if sir will allow me to rephrase that a little bit. So far, we've been talking about social catalysts that bring people into these situations. But what about mental health? And I think the attendee who's asking this question has been working in the Middle East, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, war-torn regions of conflict. So his question is essentially, what about the mental health component of victims of trauma? Could be PTSD or other such disorders, which are mental health disorders, more than just peer pressure or being led astray. Do you have anything to speak to that?
Hi, Raghavan. Yeah, good to see you. We are not talking about what we did as a panacea for all, for all things, that we have a solution and we are going around looking for nails to hit it with. So it's not like that. We are very aware that, and which shows also because, say, recidivism, which is what is the indicator or the measure we use and things like that, the relapse into the same kind of behavior. So it's effective maybe 20-25% of the cases, and 75% of the people who go through it revert to whatever their thing is. So it is not that it really is a surefire thing, but it gives an opportunity for that. And certainly we had people in this cohort who are actually very severely clinically depressed people. So they really need to go to some other place and not into CBT. We had people who are really hardened criminals, who are very far down that path. We had people who are, drug addicts and dependent on, money from theft or whatever to support their, whatever their habit. So such kind of people, are not the kind of people maybe who would benefit by this thing. And what they require is really a much more professional and much more clinical intervention, really, to deal with whatever is going on with them. And and we did not go there at all. So that's what I could say, Raghavan. Yeah. Balaji, if you have something to say.
No, I think what you said is true. I think there are models and methods people have done in these conflict-ridden zones and then working with that. And some of them are very intervention-heavy, one-to-one based therapy kind of frameworks. This is more like CBT-based framework that we have used for a training kind of a framework and a cohorts of this kind. And CBT can be used one-to-one as well. People do that, counseling, etc. But that's a different cup of tea altogether.
Yeah, actually, CBT, it started off as cognitive behavior therapy, but what we are doing is cognitive behavior training. We are not really therapy, because therapy is really very intensive,
one-to-one,
small group, one specific problem.
Yeah,
so what we devised is a training program, which is very different, because it follows a set, say this is the module 1, module 2, module 3, and it takes its course.
No, broadly, I think the principles of
not be like that.
CBT, what we used is what we have done. In sense, the issues in CBTs are automatic behaviors, being sensitive to that, understanding cognitively what underlies that perception and therefore those automatic behaviors, and creating space to do some work at home and practice or desensitize yourself to some of those behaviors and those perceptions are the fun, and also some kind of anchoring in society kind of a thing. And these are the broad principles of CBT. And there's a certain reflection back to the individual as to what flaws in the thinking and other kinds of stuff, so that people become sensitive and get cognitive about it, and therefore they start changing their behavior. So that's the whole philosophy of this therapy. So we have taken those principles and tried to apply to a large group setting. So they are two different settings altogether. Yeah. So it can work for mild level issues and people who have who have not crossed the Rubicon, like Shashi said, or who need clinical help. Clinical depression cannot be helped by this. It's a chemical imbalance. So you need chemicals to be able to bring it back. While we are psychosomatic beings, our thought processes also can influence the chemicals that are generated in our body. But certain things might require a larger intervention or a specific chemical intervention. So I think those are a different sense. So thanks, Shashi. Thanks, Vijay.
Thank you, sir. So one last question, if you don't mind. At Vishwa Talks, what we essentially are trying to do is raise awareness for these topics. And my question is pertinent to that approach. It is in our best interest as a society to help these individuals and help them regain control of their lives and help them be decriminalized, as you say. And of course, because of COVID, a lot of people are, employment has become very difficult. People are losing jobs, people are losing livelihood. So my question is pertinent to the correlation between crime and livelihood and the vicious cycle therein. Because if they are charged or if they are deemed criminals, they do not get employed, and if they do not get employed, there's a very big chance of a relapse for them to go back to crime as a source of livelihood, if nothing else. Can you speak a little bit on this dichotomy, on this correlation of livelihood and the importance of livelihood and criminal behavior?
It's very strange, because as part of what we had originally planned, we had planned some livelihood, like we as Yugantha, we have done a lot of work in the past Tech Mahindra Foundation, we ran training centers for them, you know, which were really skill building and placements. You do skill building, you do a 3-month course or a 4-month course, and then also have placement services. So we thought we'll offer a module like that to these people. And funnily enough, there's no taker at all for it. I mean, they're just not interested in that because all of them actually are people who are productive in the sense, you know, they are butchers amongst them. There are people who are own small tea stalls, small vendors. So, and because it's overwhelmingly also Muslims who are part of our thing. And the bulk of them, you know, were really people who were doing stuff on their own. There, of course, there were some unemployed people there, but it was a negligible part of the whole. There were people who are masseurs. So the old city is very famous for doing massages.
Bone setters and all that. So I think, like
Yeah.
Shashi rightly said, much of the group here was not a question of their lack of employability. I think one of the key things that the kind of cohort that we had, their rowdy sheets, etc., many of them were involved or accused of crimes to the extent of murders, kind of a thing, deaths, that process. So we hadn't found in our cohort anybody who was a thief, kind of a thing. Many of them were, like, for example, there were 2 brothers or 3 brothers. they were upset that somebody was teasing a sister. They went and bashed up. A fellow died after 1 week being in the hospital. So they got themselves into that kind of thing. So like that, you know, many of them. So these are
More than petty crimes. More than petty crimes.
These are not like thievery.
Property disputes with neighbors.
Yeah. So there's some violence involved.
Something.
In stuff. So
gang fights.
Yeah.
There's no real demand in that sense for. I mean, there's no direct correlation between unemployment and what you might call criminal behavior or violence amongst youth, if you want to take it like that. And this is borne out by global studies also, because it actually makes for a very easy hypothesis, you know, to say there's unemployment and unemployment breeds this thing and this thing breeds violence and so on. It's a very kind of neat thing to think, but it's actually not borne out by empirical studies.
Right. And there are organizations around the world, you know, that employ rehabilitated criminals, right? But the stage at which you are intervening is pre-rehabilitation, pre-prison time. But of course, they are being stigmatized. They will not get jobs. They will find it very difficult. So if you were to reach out to organizations and say, you know, give them a shot, give them an opportunity, what would be your message? What would be a supporting argument? Because they haven't been through what we call formal rehabilitation by the state.
Yeah, that is true. These sheets are still there on them. So basically, it is that they deserve a chance. That's what, if there's a corporate which is sensitive enough to think, okay, we need to give these people a chance. And if these people actually are looking to work in a corporate, because this kind of stuff usually happens in corporates, you know. We have a policy, we have a diversity policy, we have a gender policy, we have a transgender policy, we have a disability policy, and so on. No, there's so many of these things where corporate HR is sensitive to these issues and say, okay, let's have a policy. So it would be good really if corporates have a policy where they say, okay, these people are on these lists, but let's give them a chance and put in place some thing about behavior or how you're going to monitor them. But certainly they are deserving of a chance to, you know, get back into mainstream.
Balaji sir, you having worked extensively in the corporate sector, do you have anything to add to this?
I think, like Shashi said, I think progressive organizations do keep policies that are appropriate. For example, when I was involved with Satyam, we did do something on the HIV/AIDS. We did think that no discrimination and no stigmatization in case you come to know. So we did extensive campaigns inside and extensive training of people, etc. Similarly, we had gender sensitivity and then gender organization and sexual harassment related issues, etc. So far, in the situation that we are in and what kind of groups that we have seen in this 2,000, 3,000 or 5,000 people on rowdy sheets, the likelihood of their engaging in a corporate world seems to be very low to me. Many of them are self-employed. Many of them are competent. They have got skills or they have small businesses like painters, electricians, and all of that. And they are independent contractors. And in case they do want work or something like that, we cannot, companies can be a little more open. But we haven't found very many in the whole group of 60 people also, excepting one, I think, who was a graduate or something. The rest of them were all kind of dropouts at different levels of the formal education. So from a formal organizations offering jobs, etc., I see the possibility of that intersect seems to be smaller. However, but it's a good idea to have a very progressive thing. Just because somebody made a mistake that gets condemned forever or stigmatized forever is not the right thing. And I'm sure progressive organizations do have progressive policies.